Dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, my name is Jorge Heine. I direct the Pardee Center. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here at the Boston launch of the Quincy Institute report toward a better security order. My good friend and colleague Min wrote to me this morning. She was somewhat concerned about the snowstorm and today's turnout. I told her, when you put up good events, people will show up, and you did. So much appreciated weathering, braving this snow and this day. This is a major study that could not come at a better time as we grapple with our troubled world, have difficulty just in following the headlines from day to day, what is happening in Washington and across the world. And we are extremely lucky to have such a stellar panel to present it. But before getting into the substance of the report and to introduce our speakers, let me just say why it is especially appropriate for the Pardee School and for the Pardee Center to host this event. The Quincy Institute is a new non-partisan think tank established in Washington, D.C. not too long ago. Its objective is to bring a fresh perspective on the role that the United States should play in the world, something urgently needed in a city badly affected by groupthink and by some sort of faux consensus. I've lived on and on in Washington many times and know it firsthand. The Quincy Institute is playing really a very important role in this debate. But what I would like to underscore is that a driving force behind the very establishment of the Quincy Institute is Professor Andrew Bacevich, who was affiliated for a long time with Boston University and is a professor emeritus at the Pardee School, and of course, one of the leading voices on US foreign policy. And he is the chairman of the board of the Quincy Institute. Thus, for the Pardee School, it is especially gratifying to be able to host this launch of this new report released last November, which has made quite a splash, and there are plenty of copies there. I'm still transiting from the days and the years of Gutenberg to those of Zuckerberg. So I was ready to say you can download it from the web, but Dr. Pardee was kind enough to bring quite a number of copies from Washington, D.C., and they are available there. The report is the product of an 18-month project that brought together 130 experts, scholars, and practitioners from over 40 countries, including the Global North and the Global South, and all P5 members. It did some very exhaustive work. I think I spent about an hour and a half with Dr. Pardee on the phone as he queried me on all sorts of topics. So I know how hard they worked on producing this report. Its basic goal is to stabilize the international security order in transition. As I said earlier, the world is a troubled place, and something needs to be done to avoid matters from getting even worse. Enhanced norms and laws can help us in that regard. The reports put forward 20 proposals and reforms aimed at getting there, considering the role of the United States and other great powers, as well as that of middle powers in smaller states. I will let the panelists address the subject of what these reforms are all about, but let me just enumerate them. They are: 1, an improved UN Security Council; 2, tightening norms around the use of force; 3, avoiding nuclear war; 4, rules of the road for economic sanctions; 5, climate peace and security; 6, a last line of defense against rogue AI; and 7, buttressing order and stability in Europe and the Middle East, areas of the world that are particularly affected by tragic wars as we speak. And to elaborate on these reforms and the report more broadly, we have with us one of its main authors, Dr. Trita Parsi on my right, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute and one of its co-founders. Dr. Parsi is a distinguished political scientist and the author of 3 award-winning books from Yale University Press on diplomacy in the Middle East. He won the Grauweiler Award, one of the most prestigious in the discipline, in 2008, and has been listed by Washingtonian Magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in the US Capitol. We're also lucky enough to have with us another of the authors of the report, Professor Stephen Walt of the Kennedy School at Harvard, across the river, who is the Robert and Rennie Belford Professor of International Affairs, a columnist at Foreign Policy Magazine, whose column is mandatory reading for all of those who want to keep up with what is happening in world affairs. He is the author of numerous books, including Taming American Power, Revolution and War, and The Hell of Good Intentions, great title, among many others. And last but not least, of course, our very own Dr. Menier, Professor of International Relations here at the Pardee School, and one of the leading scholars on China's IR and foreign policy. She is the author of 3 important books on China's IR, all from leading university presses, including Belt Road and Beyond from Cambridge University Press. One of my enduring pleasures in my 6 years here at the Pardee School has been to be able to work together with Min. Welcome, our dean is here. Good to see you. And you know, in Spanish there is this great expression, escribir algo a 4 manos, which means you write something with 4 hands, meaning 2 people writing the same piece. It is a true test of collegiality and friendship. We have done this with Min, and our friendship has survived. So, without further ado, let me leave with you Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, who will present this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jorge, and great pleasure to be here with all of you, to be here with Steve and Min. Coming from DC, it's always great to come to a city that reacts appropriately to a little bit of snow. You guys don't seem to panic. You don't close down everything. You don't start talking about Armageddon just because of a little snow. And so it's deeply refreshing to know that it actually can be done in the right way. Particularly happy to be here to talk to you all about the report and what we are trying to achieve with it, the ideas that is in it. And I think particularly mindful of what is happening right now with the Trump administration pulling out of the WHO. I think we're going to have an executive order with sanctions on the ICC anytime today, and frontal assault on a lot of international institutions. But I think it actually gives us a particularly important opportunity to rethink then, if this is what we're doing now, what have we actually done in the past, and how different or not different is it? Clearly it is different. But what we were doing with this report is to also really review and try to understand, why is it that we suddenly, about 15 years ago, started to talk about the rules-based international order? What does it actually mean? And if it is the same thing as international law and the UN Charter and those institutions, what was the point of even having the term, if it is the same thing? Why did we suddenly start shifting from international law and a law-centered order to talking about a rule-centered order? And what is the difference between the two, if there is any? And why is it that so many countries, particularly in the global south, to be frank, absolutely despise the term rules-based order? Is it because they don't like rules? They want to live in complete anarchy? They fear international order? Is that the reason why they're turning around against it? Or is it something else that this means to them that perhaps we in the United States have not fully grasped? So I'm going to get to that in a second, but just to say a couple of things of how we did this. as Jorge mentioned, we brought together about 130 scholars, former officials, foreign ministers, defense ministers, UN ambassadors from 40 different countries to really rethink how can we make sure that as the world is transitioning away from unipolarity, that both that transition is stabilized, but also that the end point can be stabilized. We already know that the international institutions that we have today are truly out of sync with reality. They're outdated, they're not performing particularly well. There is plenty of reasons of criticizing them. Some sort of an upgrade is absolutely needed, but it is particularly needed because we are going to transition away, or we have already transitioned away, from a world that was unipolar. This systemic change is more important than almost anything else in terms of how outdated these institutions are. And so much of the thinking, or lack thereof, in Washington, when it came to talking about future orders or future institutions, what needs to be done, etc., seemed to either implicitly or explicitly assume that in the future, the United States would continue to remain a unipolar power. It was almost heretic to even talk about this as a reality today or a forthcoming reality. Now, of course, you have a Secretary of State that suddenly started to say that the world is multipolar and probably shocked a lot of people because no one would imagine him saying that 4 months ago, but now he does. The bottom line is, for a very long time in Washington, it was really not what we were doing in terms of thinking of a future order in a non-unipolar context. So we wanted to do this because we realized that everything else would frankly not be up to par. And as a result, we also wanted to bring in all of these other countries, particularly rising middle powers, who are going to play a crucial role, already are, but even more so in the future. Then we did something else that I think distinguishes this project, also perhaps makes our proposals a little bit too bold for the taste of some. But we imagined in all of the exercises that we did that we were in the year 2040. We imagined that almost all of the existing geopolitical trends would continue apace. The United States and China would continue to gravitate towards some sort of a conflict, but the conflict had not yet happened. The Security Council would increasingly become irrelevant because it's not reformed, but we're still not at the moment of collapse. But we are right at the precipice of it, 15 years closer to it than we are today. We continue to talk a lot about climate. We do far too little, and we're closer and closer to a collapse. And add on to that 15 years from now, there will not just be an intellectual conversation about having moved on from unipolarity, whether it's a multipolar world or whatever else it is, but actually countries have now started to internalize that and act accordingly, which means that their perception of their interests will become different because this is a profound systemic change. And then we asked ourselves, well, in that scenario, how does the United States or a China or a France or a South Africa or a Brazil or a Chile look at some of these questions that are currently deadlocked, such as UN Security Council reform, or climate, or non-proliferation, or a very important one is, of course, AI and the use of force. These are issues in which we have very significant difficulties making headway today, and we didn't want to replicate the deadlock of today. We wanted to assume for 15 years, at a time when you all will be in key positions, that we still haven't done anything, but because of these systemic changes, perhaps it will help unlock flexibilities that currently do not exist. And from there on, we developed some of these proposals with the idea that if we know with a degree of certainty that this is the world we will be in 15 years from now, and we know with a degree of certainty that in the future, our interests will shift and we will actually be open to some of these proposals and ideas, then we can already now start working towards creating the political space and pathway for those reforms to be implemented. To give you just two small examples. Right now, the United States is the country that uses extraterritorial financial sanctions, although the American view is that it's not extraterritorial, but the rest of the view views it as extraterritorial financial sanctions. To a very significant extent, we have seen a mushrooming of sanctions in general, but precisely because we're the only ones that are using the international financial system as an instrument of American power, and we're the only ones that can, we have no interest in any particular norms, laws, or rules for the road on how to use these sanctions. Within the next 15 years, we are very likely going to see China in particular also start using these type of tools. They're already looking at it. That will dramatically change our perspective on whether there is any value in having any rules and laws about how to use these things. We obviously do not have any particular, we're not the real obstacle necessarily at the UN Security Council in terms of reforming it. But we would probably prefer to keep it as is. We have the veto and many of the benefits of it. But when you're faced with a moment in which actually you either reform it or you lose it, then we're also losing the veto if the Security Council becomes irrelevant. At that moment, we will probably have far greater flexibility than we feel the need to have today. So we were pushing ourselves into those scenarios in order to develop these proposals. But the overarching thing of all of this was to recognize that the pathway that we've been on, particularly under the Biden administration, in which we increasingly talked not about the UN system, not about international law, but the rules-based international order, that actually was not an effort, as it was presented, to sustain a status quo. It was oftentimes presented as if we're trying to defend the post-Cold War order. In our assessment, the rules-based international order instrument was actually an anti-status quo instrument because it was seeking to replace a law-centered order with a rule-centered order, with a very significant difference. International law, treaties you sign on to, we haven't signed on to the Rome Statute, so we're not beholden to the ICC issuing an arrest warrant on Netanyahu. Other countries have, so we're not beholden to it. Rules do not have the same objective process of being formed, nor are they inclusive. They're actually usually done by a coalition of countries led by the United States. And then we are expecting that other countries have to follow the rules we decided. And this is a key reason as to why you have such a rejection of it from Global South countries. They are at a moment in which they believe their relative power in the system has reached a point in which now finally they will have a greater say in things. But at that moment, we're doing, from their perspective, a switch and bait. And suddenly we're going away from international law and going towards rules in which they are automatically excluded unless they're already on board. Take a look at what the 2022 National Security Strategy of the Biden administration said about the rules-based order. It didn't even describe it as a governing structure for the world. The phraseology, if I remember correctly, says, and you have it quoted in the report, is that those who subscribe to the rules-based order will also receive support from the United States for their military defenses. This is more a description of a bloc rather than a governing structure that is universal. The danger with that, in our view, is first, we're misunderstanding it as if it is a status quo instrument defending against those who are trying to overturn the post-World War order. But in essence, it actually is anti-status quo itself. But the bigger the challenge then is, what if the Russians and the Chinese or whoever else also then react by seeking to create their own coalition of the willing type of orders, their own rules-based order that deviates from the UN Charter and international law? The danger we saw then is that instead of just moving away from unipolarity and towards whether it's a bipolar, multiplex, multipolar order, we would move towards a multi-order world in which you would have competing orders, which would be much more dangerous than what we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was clearly two orders, but there was a recognition of a super order, which was the UN system, which was international law. We disagreed on a lot of things at the UN Security Council, but we agreed that Chapter 7 resolutions are binding. There was an acceptance of that super order. we will then potentially then move towards not just arguing over the interpretation of law, but towards a multi-order world in which we have competing systems of law, which would be far more destabilizing than what we have now. Now, here's the interesting twist of all of this. I would predict, I would almost put my mortgage on the idea that in the next 4 years, we will never hear Donald Trump say the words rules-based international order. In fact, in his NSS 2017, I believe, there was no mention of it at all. It's probably because he's not crazy about rules in the first place, or any international institutions in the first place. But I think we have to recognize, or at least in my assessment, and many of those who were part of the project, is that yes, this is also an extremely dangerous, as I said, a frontal attack. But it's not as if what we were doing before actually was holding up the system. We were actually hollowing it out from a different direction, which was also very, very dangerous. And the conclusion is that as weak, as problematic, as challenging, as worthy of reform, as many of these institutions and laws are, the worst situation we could have is actually start from scratch or having these competing orders. Because rebuilding this, rebuilding the norms around the use of force that came as a result of the disasters and the suffering of the World War II, if we were to redo it, it would probably end up becoming much weaker than what we have right now. So reinvesting in that, rejuvenating that, and trying to strengthen that, ultimately, in our view, is in interest of the United States itself, as well as the global system as a whole. And that is why we have these 20 proposals on different ways in different areas in which we think that this can be reinforced. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here on this snowy day. I should say at the outset, I was an active participant in the conferences, and it was a wonderful exercise in international diplomacy with people from different sectors and lots of different countries. And I want to make it abundantly clear that, as in most international conferences, I did not get everything that I wanted. If you read the final report, there are things in there I might not have written, and there are things in there that others might not have written. Nonetheless, I think it's an incredibly valuable exercise for a variety of reasons, which I'll get to. Let me make a couple of comments about the report, and then I want to talk about its arrival at this particular moment with the Trump administration. The first point I'd make is say just something about this distinction between rules-based order and international law. It's important to understand that international law is also a system of rules, right? It's not rules versus law. Laws are basically rules. The difference is the manner in which those rules are created and legitimated and obeyed, right? Where a rules-based order is basically a subset making a set of rules and then holding the rest of the world, or trying to hold the rest of the world up to them, while feeling free to violate the rules whenever it feels like it. International law-based is a much more bottom-up, much more consensual, much more has to command international acceptance to work. So again, it's not like law and rules are two different things. They just, in this case, come from slightly different origins. Second point I'd make about the report is that it's, I think, critical to understand that the proposals in this report are not a sort of take it or leave it blueprint, that you have to adopt them in toto. This is what's going to be in place in 2014 if you just listen to us. It's much more of a starting point for a global conversation, and that's important. They have to be credible enough proposals to spark that conversation. They can't be seen as so unrealistic that no one will take them seriously and start talking about them. But what the ultimate outcome might be by 2035 or 2040 will be determined by process. It will also, of course, be determined by what happens in the interim and what we learn along the way. In fact, there needs to be flexibility built into this process because we're going to acquire more knowledge. Experience is going to accumulate on a number of these issues, most notably, say, something like AI, where we're all just trying to get a handle on exactly what that means. And my model here, by the way, if any of you know about it, is the Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbons, which, when it was initially adopted, had a lot of wiggle room in a variety of ways and adopted the so-called precautionary principle that they were going to err on the side of caution in the face of uncertainty. Over time, as we learned more about the science, of what was going on and the science of some of the alternatives, you could adapt the protocol and implement it in various ways as you got smarter. So again, the proposals that are being put forth here in 2025 are not necessarily the final form they may take. They are, in fact, not a take it or leave it blueprint as well. All right, now let me say a word or two about what this means given the Trump administration. I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration would be hostile to almost everything this project stands for. He is sometimes described as an isolationist, which I think is fundamentally inaccurate. When you're talking about building hotels and taking over Gaza, you are not an isolationist. He is a unilateralist, he is a nationalist, he is a sovereigntist. Nothing should infringe upon American sovereignty, and he doesn't like any sort of rules that might bind the United States in any fashion. He doesn't like rules in general, but that's a separate point. But the point is, this is not unique to Donald Trump. This is a deeply held position that has roots in American history. It has roots in lots of institutions within the United States, including think tanks in Washington as well. There was a great New York Times op-ed on exactly this issue, I think last week, on the sovereigntist view of the American position in the world. So in a sense, this project is going up against something that has not been reflexively adopted by Americans in the past. And Donald Trump exemplifies that, I think, more than any American leader ever. But ironically, the Trump administration, and I think Trump himself, also recognizes that many aspects of the current order, and including the current rules-based order, are obsolescent. Right? However useful they may have been in the past, have been overtaken by events. He has serious questions about NATO. There are aspects about the American relationship to our European partners that do need revision, right? And people who want to stay in NATO and think NATO is a positive institution, nonetheless also believe it's in need of substantial reform. You can think of the Oslo peace process as an enduring institution, long-standing, been around for 30 plus years. Something has gone wrong there. That's no longer the ideal way forward as well. The World Trade Organization may have accomplished some very useful things from 1990s into the aughts. It's broken now and at a minimum needs substantial reform. So the fact that the Trump administration is skeptical about some of these institutions is not by itself a bad thing. The problem is that he seems to be wanting to dismantle these institutions, but a lot of other ones and a lot of fundamental norms almost overnight. This notion, since World War II, that you didn't revise borders through the use of force. All right, that's a norm that has been under pressure in a variety of different ways, a number of prominent violations, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, Israel on the Golan Heights, West Bank, etc. But you've never seen the United States standing up and openly saying, borders, these are negotiable. And furthermore, they're negotiable at the point of a gun, right? This has been a new position for the United States. The fact that the United States a few days ago seemed to, in the voice of the president, seemed to be endorsing ethnic cleansing. Something, again, the United States has not been promoting in the past. The notion that almost any treaty or agreement that was signed is up for grabs and up for renegotiation. You can sign a trade arrangement with Canada and Mexico in 2017, declare it to be incredible, and then in 2025 come back and say we need to tear that up fundamentally if you don't do what I want. And then finally, leaving the World Health Organization, going after the International Criminal Court, leaving the Paris Climate Accord. These are all unraveling. The point I want to emphasize here is that norms and institutions, no matter how much you like American sovereignty, norms and institutions in a world that interacts every single day are absolutely indispensable. You cannot function in a world without a set of rules. You can't fly airplanes from the United States to Great Britain if Great Britain decides it doesn't want to follow the Warsaw Convention on International Air Travel and use English as the language of air traffic control. Country is free, is sovereign, can say that they no longer subscribe to that and they're going to use, Urdu for air traffic control, and planes will stop flying to that country the next day. So you need a set of rules here. And ironically, Trump may be clearing the deck without having an idea of what norms, what institutions to replace them with. What I see as the main danger there is the United States withdraws from a lot of these processes or tries to do them all on an ad hoc bilateral basis. And in fact, the norms and institutions that will govern world politics going forward or shape world politics going forward get made by others. And I want to give just one funny example of how this works. So I spent the fall over in Europe, and just before I got there, the European Union had adopted a regulation that meant that the caps to juice containers had to be attached. So you couldn't just take the cap off. It was an environmental measure to facilitate recycling, right? British people began to protest, got very upset, because their juice containers arriving from the continent had this attached cap on it. This was outrageous. It is a little bit inconvenient, as it turns out. This was outrageous. But of course, this regulation got adopted by the European Union, and the British weren't there for the discussion. Why? Because they'd left the European Union back in 2019 as well. So if you leave the table or the negotiating forum where these rules or norms are getting determined, you may find yourself having to deal with rules and norms that are subscribed to by others that you had no voice. And that's, I think, the risk we face here. One more major point. What do I think the main challenge here going forward in advancing the agenda that this report lays out? The biggest challenge is making the consequences of not acting, of not moving in this direction, tangible to people. Major order-making moments in the past have almost always occurred after catastrophes like World War II, when the costs of not having those rules and norms was obvious to everyone. People knew exactly what the dangers were. Now it's much harder to convince people that if you don't fix the UN Security Council, some bad things are going to happen. You know, we haven't fixed it in a long time, etc. If AI, we have some proposals in the report about a sort of a fire department for AI disasters down the road. It's, I think, a real concern, but convincing people that's a problem when it probably won't be a big problem for another 5 or 10 years might be hard. Preventive action, taking prudent steps so that bad things don't happen down the road, is always harder to do than dealing with the emergency when it's actually upon you. It's the smart thing to do, as we know from pandemic preparedness, as we know from what happened with the fires out in Los Angeles, etc. But motivating people to do things that might be costly, that might be difficult in advance, I think, is the major challenge that we're all going to face. And unfortunately, we may have to wait a few years for a US government that will get fully behind that effort. And on that optimistic note, I will stop.
And now with you, Professor Mingye.
Okay, well, thank you to the Pardee Center for organizing this event and giving me this opportunity to read the report and commenting on it. Congratulations to both of you. I thought it was him. Okay, well then congratulations to Dr. Pardee and the completion of the report. How many of you have read it? Okay, okay. So it's if you haven't,
Up in the midterm.
yeah. If you haven't, please seize the moment, opportunity after this event, and do read it. I thought Dr. Pardee will be giving you an overview of what the proposals are. But so there are 7 major variables that are super important to the new world order, and then they proposed 20 actions proposal, and all of them are just very, very rich, and they do very good job, a lot of care. So, and I do see significant potential for addressing the precarity that we feel in this world. And I think agreeing with Professor Walt that further conversation, further collaboration. That's essential. And so this report is a launching pad, and what's happening now, I think, is what makes and breaks for the proposed or more secure world order. So my comments are really informed by my Asian and China experience. So in Asia, right? So my first book, the first book, I look at the dynamics of critical juncture in regional institution building, right? In East Asia, and here, what's a critical juncture? Critical juncture is you do need to have a crisis, and it could be real, but it could also be perceived crisis, and then you do need to in Asia you need to have regional leadership, but more importantly, the kinds of transnational policy networks were in place, and in Asia nothing happens if you don't have the three Trinity actors, right? The bureaucrats, the local officials, the businesses, and the scholars. And business and the local officials, actually, they share same commercial industrial interests in Asia. So scholarly communities, bureaucratic communities, and then the business communities. And so when you have those dots are in row, the outcome actually is quite effective. And I want to highlight that in East Asia's regionalism, the U.S. absence was actually a critical facilitator. Right, so in the book we call it benign neglect, and so later Clinton and early Bush era, that was the U.S. distraction and not paying attention to Asia. That was a very big moment for regional actors to lead to some fruition. So maybe in interesting way, we are in a moment of, with the U.S. focusing on self-reform, and then the regional and global issues are so severe. This might be another critical juncture. Right. And then the second observation is about China. So China's foreign policy, I kind of call it like selfish statecraft, because for China to be playing some kind of leadership role in multilateral settings, it needs to work for the Chinese domestic priorities, right? So from this point of view, I do find that the two propositions, the climate and the AI, to be low-hanging fruit for cooperation, getting more active engagements from China and the global South. The green energy, green sectors in China, in terms of industry, commercial interests, are very, very compelling in the country, and the going out momentum is right there. And then the artificial intelligence, of course, China is one of the major players, has been struggling with AI governance, experimenting with AI governance for actually earlier than this country. And so I think you can find a lot of more actions in these two areas, and they are also, to me, are on the global priority agenda. Right? And so these two are quite important. And so I have, the comments from Professor Walt and Dr. Pardee kind of explained, clarified some of my ambiguities, but I want to share the three ambiguities I wrote when I was reading the comments. The first is on the competing orders, right? And that's on the page 7. So I think it's still unclear in the report when you mention the rule-based international order, RBIO, and the China-Russia rival order. And are you like more on the lines of coalitions, or are there entirely different visions or rules that you can deduce from them. Like if these orders, like if most of countries in the world fall out of these two orders, then why do we pay so much attention to them? So I think the scope of these two so-called rival orders and what are the mechanisms? Are they just two blocks which are limiting and self-shrinking blocks, or are they really representing visions or mechanisms and rules of the game moving forward? And so I was just reading John Eikenberry's recent article called Three World System, right? So he, again, I also feel that's not a little bit ambiguous, but he does try to say there's a global West order led by America and the kinds of values, and then global East that's co-led by China and Russia, and with certain Eastern values, and then you have the global South, right? That's like his way of trying to at least there are three robust grouping in the world. So I don't know how you guys feel about this three world system he was writing. The second, again, is I'm like hoping to push you beyond the current proposals. So these proposals, for example, the U.S.-China initiative on economic warfare. You focus on economic sanction. I feel like it could almost say it's economic warfare because a lot of these sanctions are meant to deliver real damage and to very critical capacity of the other country. So we are entering a phase of possible economic warfare. Again, so this initiative in terms of how to think about economic warfare and how to prevent it and how to envision the directions. That's a U.S.-China initiative, right? And then you have Planetary 20 to address climate and the AI governance that will involve many different countries. So my question for you guys are you thinking about like it's organizational links with representatives, like a mechanism, or it's trying to figure out solutions and mechanisms? Do you think about this as some sort of track one, like official diplomacy proposition, or track two, non-governmental, or track 1.5 efforts? I think once we have this clearer step forward, like the organizational elements and then the mechanism elements, it could be because the need is very clear. How do we do it and how we can continue the process? That's something that I want to see more or from the second report if you guys are doing. The last point is on China. Again, I look at the Chinese, I interact with domestic Chinese groups frequently. And so I saw that in these reports, all the Chinese participants are scholars and IR scholars, and then a couple, foreign policy-oriented think tanks. I don't know whether this matters, but I wonder how much they represent the ruling class in China, right? Such as the broader state sectors, broader businesses, and broader scholarly communities. To me, a lot of the Chinese, if you interact beyond this foreign policy scholar cohort, then they will often mention that the Chinese main objectives are domestic, right? They face a lot of domestic challenges, population decline, aging, and then unemployment, debts, slowing economy. Basically, if we look at anything about China, the last couple of years, it's all these challenges that the Chinese ruling class and the leadership has to grapple with. And so if it's about China, how China can contribute to the global collaboration, then how much willingness you detect from this process. And second is about capability. I don't want to minimize my Chinese colleagues, but I feel like a lot of them are not foreign policy or international relations trained professionals. That's very different kinds of, in other words, I haven't seen a class of global professionals in China, or they are kind of spread across many walks of society. They haven't really become a cohort, which is quite prominent in the US and in Europe. You can identify the global professionals, that class who share similar visions, similar vocabulary and thinking. And so that part might be still missing in China. Lastly, so when I look at the report, and in the end, there are pictures, that very nice photos, and I saw the participants, in particular, the participants from China, look very serious. They're very serious looking. So I wonder, as you were involved in this process, and what was the dynamic, your sense, were these not only the Chinese, but also the many countries' representatives, were they like they're kind of representing their own national interests, like speaking about their country's restrictions and preferences, or they're there kind of start to have this shared values, norms, like we begin to see a sort of epistemic policy network building. So what's the dynamic? What do you feel that these people being there, trying to advocate for the nation or become a proactive agent for the world order you guys are trying to improve?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we will now open the floor for questions. We have a mic here. I have plenty of questions myself, but the idea is to open it up to you who are here. So,
Stephen's impression as well as a very involved participant in Jorge as well, who was also involved in it. Let me first say, with all of the different countries, we went to people for a variety of reasons. They may have very deep but narrow expertise on a specific element of global governance, or they served as foreign minister and as a result have a deep understanding of not only what their country's interest is now, but they are in a position to be able to imagine what their country's position likely will be in the future in these scenarios that we put forward. And we explicitly told everyone that you have to kind of check your own opinions a little bit at the door and try to be a representative of your country in these different conversations. And in some cases, we also know, without naming, some of the participants checked with their own governments before coming back with feedback or signing on to the project. In some cases, the country sent sitting officials to our meetings. Some of them saying, I speak in a personal capacity. One of them saying, I'm not speaking in a personal capacity. So in some ways, imagine Congress of Vienna. It was kind of like that, I think, in some ways. So, but it was very essential for us because your question is very important. This was not just supposed to be an eclectic collection of people from different countries who just presented their own views. It was really supposed to be, and they were instructed to think in terms of what their national interests. I also wanted to address another question, the earlier question you asked about the multi-orders. I think our assessment is the Biden administration failed. The RBIO took on a tremendous amount of increase of mentions. It was adopted by the Europeans without knowing what they signed on to. A lot of Europeans actually explicitly thought it's the same thing as international law. In their interpretation, it is, not understanding that that's not necessarily the American perspective or how the Biden administration was viewing it. But after Gaza, perhaps to little surprise, the Biden administration, by and large, stopped using that term themselves. We counted very few occasions, and the only ones that they still used it for was in the context of Ukraine. Obviously never in the context of Gaza. So because of the proximity between Ukraine and Gaza in time, and because of the just overwhelming contradiction, I mean, this is a degree of double standard that was just very difficult to muster for anyone. Already the Biden administration itself essentially had to give up on this. So I don't think we ever reached a point, thankfully, in which it really took on in the manner that we thought would be dangerous, in the sense that it would prompt the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else to also start putting together their own alternative. As I mentioned earlier, till this point, whether we agree with what they say or not, whether we agree that it is legitimately rooted or genuinely rooted in international law, that is still what the Chinese are anchoring their positions in, referencing back to the UN Charter, etc. So they haven't moved to another concept that would become their RBIO. And if that were to happen, we obviously think that that's very bad. But our assessment here was more of a warning that this would be a very dangerous evolution of this. Steve, I'm eager to hear your views on.
Yeah. So, I mean, this won't, I think, surprise anybody. This was a very diverse group of people from all over the world in different walks of life, and it was good to get some people who were representing sort of their national perspective as they saw it. It's also a sophisticated group, so when someone did that, we all kind of knew it. All right, she is speaking on behalf of, whatever. But even within that context, you had some surprising moments where you would have someone speaking from, say, the Russian perspective who would suddenly say something surprising that you might not have expected, that wasn't just sort of standard talking points, that sort of thing. So I think it was pretty successful in getting lots of views on the table, but also eliciting, suddenly there's something we could all agree on. We all converge. So in that sense, I think it worked remarkably well. I wanted to say two other just quick points in response to what Min said. First of all, that we may be seeing, I'm not sure how I feel about this, we may be seeing actually a convergence happening between some of the major powers. If spheres are starting to emerge, one of the convergences, again, in response to sort of Trump and where he may take the country, is that the notion that the United States stands for a set of democratic values and tries to promote them around the world. Not obvious to me that this is an administration that's going to place much weight on that, which means its view of sovereignty starts to look much more like that of China. We are going to run China the way we want. You run your country however you want. We're not going to give lectures to other countries on how they run their internal affairs. So suddenly the United States and China are more closely aligned than they have been.
Might grab their territory, but we're not going to
Yeah, exactly. So that's it. And then finally, just this issue of economic warfare. I want to highlight why rules matter, why norms matter, why institutions matter. It has been a well-established principle, not always followed, but a well-established principle in the liberal economic order that you were not supposed to engage in beggar thy neighbor trade policies. So you could impose trade restrictions if another country was dumping, right? You could impose trade restrictions if you wanted to protect a particular national security concern. You could impose trade restrictions if you had, say, consumer product safety standards that were more stringent than some other country. You could force their products to conform to them. They could be kept out. You do all those things. You couldn't do those measures in order to try and hurt another country's economy deliberately. So to take a concrete example, you can exclude Huawei 5G products from the United States on national security grounds. If that's your genuine reason, you have concerns about that and they're well-founded, you can do that. You can't do it if your goal is to destroy Huawei as a company and hold China back in terms of technological development. That's a violation of what has been the existing set of norms and rules governing international trade. You could imagine a set of rules governing international trade that's totally different, where economic warfare of the sort that I think the United States and some other countries have practiced is considered perfectly okay. It's not illegal, it's not about, you may not like it, but it's part of the rules of the game. So these rules really do matter, and figuring out which ones make the most sense over the long term is part of what this project is designed to do.
Very good. Thank you very much. So, I'm keen to hear my students asking some questions, and there are many here. Just identify yourself.
Hello, my name is William. I'm a first-year master's student in international affairs here at Pardee. My question is regarding this sort of liberal international order, which is very much the basis for international law and things like that. How do you, if you are trying to promote that more, how do you reconcile that worldview with, for example, economic sanctions? Because I could see in the example you just gave, the sort of logic used for economic sanctions against a country like Iran or, Syria or somewhere like that. Couldn't you also use that as sort of the same rationale there for example, some of these tariffs we're seeing on countries like in South America that are the argument of the Trump administration is that they're sort of facilitating immigration, and so couldn't you not use the same logic there to provide a rationale for the tariffs or something like that? And how do you see that?
Trita.
First,
No, why don't you go?
Okay,
in the
I'll take-
sanctions context,
Yeah.
this is
So, first thing, we had very interesting conversations on the sanctions front, and there's some pretty stark differences in countries' perspectives. A country like Brazil has, I believe, in its constitution that they don't go along with any sanctions unless they are multilateral and endorsed by the UN Security Council. As a result, their position that all unilateral sanctions should be outlawed, which, I think some other countries like India are also aligned with that. And then you have perhaps the opposite extreme on the American side and plenty of positions in between. I think the biggest challenge, at least pre-Trump, is the usage of extraterritorial sanctions. This started in the mid-1990s by the United States, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, Helms-Burton, in which we, through our Congress, decided to pass laws for other countries. Meaning that not only if you're living in Spain, do you have to abide by Spanish law, in which you have some chance of impacting that through your elections, now you also have to abide by American law. Because we are then punishing countries if they entered the Cuban economy or invested in it. In the beginning, a lot of countries, Europe in particular, resisted this. The Clinton administration had to sign on to it, but they actually really didn't implement it because they were fearing that there would be a retaliation by the Europeans. And the Europeans went to the World Trade Organization on this. By the time of the Bush administration, something changed. Suddenly, this started to become standard. Almost all new American sanctions had an extraterritorial component. And instead of fighting it, countries started lobbying Congress in order to get carve-outs. So it was a massive capitulation. And this really started to become, all the time, this is what's happening. Then by 2006, 2007, it went one step further. Now suddenly we were using the dollar as a weapon. Every transaction in the world that involves a US dollar, which is about 79% of all international trade, for a split second, transfers through Washington, D.C. and the Treasury when it has to be cleared. And this is the justification from the American legal standpoint saying, oh, this is not an extraterritorial sanction. This is actually domestic application of domestic law because it goes through US territory. This is actually part of the reason why you have seen, sorry, it's not 70, it's gone down to 59%, but it was at 73% in the year 2000. You've seen a significant reduction of the use of the American dollar in international trade, which according to the former heads of the Treasury is actually very much driven by our excessive use of these different sanctions. So I think when it comes to your specific question, we will probably be in a world in which unilateral sanctions will probably continue to be in place, but there were some norms against that. The question is if we will get to a point in which the proliferation of it in several different directions, particularly the extraterritorial ones, would lead to a convergence of interest of trying to establish stronger norms and laws around it. Right now, you have nothing. And one of the things we're addressing in the report here that I think is very important is that we have an entire body of law, international humanitarian law, on rules and laws and norms around warfare. How you cannot target civilians. I mean, we've seen many of those norms, of course, completely violated by many actors in the last couple of years. We have nothing when it comes to economic sanctions. You're not supposed to target civilian infrastructure in a war, but civilian infrastructure is exactly what you're targeting through these massive economic sanctions. The death that it imposes on civilian populations has no protection whatsoever in international law right now. If this is going to become the future of warfare, there will need to be some norms and laws around that. And that's what we're propagating for, recognizing that it's going to be extremely difficult to actually do away with it altogether, and there's no consensus on that. But there can be a consensus on establishing norms and rules and laws around that. And we already have IHL in which we can borrow a lot of principles from.
Yeah, I agree with everything Frida just said. I would just clarify it in the following way. Economic sanctions are a perfectly legitimate tool of statecraft. And countries like Iran have been sanctioned by the UN Security Council for various violations, and sanctions imposed by the international community, the same way you've seen sanctions imposed upon Russia. There's also individual sanctions that get imposed by individual countries. And so in the case of Iran, again, there's the set of UN Security Council sanctions, but then there's the additional set of sanctions that have been imposed unilaterally by the United States. And as Trina just explained, the problem is we then extend those also to everybody else in the world and say, if you do business with Iran, we will punish you too, all right, as well. That's a different question. The reason I'm leery of the unilateral extension of sanctions the way the United States has done it is they're not very effective, right? So Iran is the most heavily sanctioned country, I think, in the history of the planet. And the purpose, of course, was to get Iran to give up nuclear enrichment. Surprise, surprise, Iran hasn't, right? Despite 25 plus years of sanctions and enormous human suffering being imposed, not on the regime, but on Iranians. So I might feel differently about the unilateral use of these weapons if they were more effective at accomplishing their purposes, but they're not. And having a greater international consensus and a normative structure and even international legal principles to guide countries would be very helpful here.
We can add to that extraordinary thing that Russia, that has been sanctioned very heavily in the course of the past few years, has been growing at a higher rate than Germany in these years, a country that is not at war formally. So, there's some question about the effectiveness of these sanctions. Anyway, any further questions?
Hi, my name is Victoria, and my question for you is, there's a lot of unfortunate anti-Chinese rhetoric in the US, and I feel like there's been a tendency to characterize China as a rival to the US, sort of similar to the idea of a second Cold War. And my question is, is China really our enemy, or is this just a characterization being imposed? And is there a way to reverse this in a way that can foster more of a cooperative rather than cutthroat competitive relation between the two? And adding on to that, what do you think the general Chinese perspective on the US is? Do you think it mirrors that of the US? And what can we do as an international system to prevent a sort of economic war between these two countries?
Min.
Okay. Well, I think the competitive dynamic is very strong from the U.S. From what I see in the U.S., it will be illusion to think the policy in the U.S. will change toward China, or Washington's rhetoric will change toward China. whoever is in power. But there will be different space for cooperation. So I think track 1.5 or track 2 and globally oriented collaborations are still very possible. So that's why I'm a believer in your report, because I think the China U.S. some kind of working group to explore how to manage economic warfare, artificial intelligence, and maybe don't be zero sum on planet. So there are issues that are doable that do not require the governments to be the leading actor. And then from the China side, I think the big difference in terms of I visit China every summer, and I think last summer's the big difference compared before is last summer most of the Chinese see the U.S. has already decided to fight China. They haven't decided that China would be the rival of the United States, but the people, the educated class who pay attention to U.S.-China relations, who has business, who has children studying here, they kind of feel the U.S. policy is quite set in stone, trying to put down China. And then in terms of like how can you do? Because this is the world's largest power, and you can't escape it. So I still see like the way that the Chinese shown the paradoxical elements. They still very much admire the U.S. system. So just from the elements of business class and middle classes, where do they send their children to study, right? Or in the States, like I just met 2 sets of parents yesterday and today, and their kids, all their kids, were studying in the United States. And what do their kids want to do? And so that's where I think I have more hope, is that their children will go back to China, maybe work in the government. Some of them even wants to work in the government and to be more better agents in terms of global affairs, international relations. The other observation that the Chinese was just telling me is they were shocked. A lot of them would visit China very frequently, and this time they were shocked at how expensive America is becoming. So when they are in China, they say, "Oh, America is doing so well because all statistics show this is such a golden age for America, and China is like this slowing all these challenges." And after their visit to America this time, they were just shocked at how expensive America has become. I don't know what to say, but I think both countries at the strategic level kind of see each other as competitors, rivals, if we are willing to use this word. But beneath the strategic level, and there are a lot of shared interest to engage with each other, in particular from the Chinese side. The third point is both of them actually are really struggling in terms of how to meet their vast population's needs for quality of life.
Very good. Next question. Yes, over there.
My name is Erin, and I'm a first year at Pardee. I have a very simple question just to kind of move it along, and then a more complicated one for someone to answer. But would you agree with the emergence of this new order that migration should be a topic of conversation as it keeps states intimately intertwined? Then my question would be, where does the reformation of the international refugee regime fit in this framework, given that immigration and its reaction, and its global reaction, namely the West and its contempt for migration and refugees, continues to keep countries intimately intertwined? Or what was the decision to omit it? And I'm only asking because as we talk about the Global South as well, over 70% of the displaced population is housed in the Global South. That has to do with passport power and all those things though, right? but also 75% of the refugee population is a result of protracted refugee situations. So I guess my question is, where does the international refugee regime in its reformation that also systemically leaves out certain refugees, namely the Palestinians, in this new framework? Thank you.
Thank you. Trita?
Excellent question. And let me give a bit of background. We had, as you will see, we identified 7 variables, but that's only half the truth. We identified a much larger number of variables, but all focused on the impact on security. So we recognize, for instance, that there's a tremendous amount of need for a reformation of the financial institutions, the World Bank, IMF, etc. But we needed to limit what we were doing to those that would have a profound impact on security. And within that category, there were still several variables that qualified for that, but for a variety of reasons, including bandwidth, we had to do away with. And we were looking at migration early on as one of the different variables that we would focus on. But did an exploration. There were a lot of different variables we were exploring. We're trying to see whether consensus could be found. We had to choose some because consensus couldn't be found, or some others because of other reasons. But we completely agree that this is crucial, but because of bandwidth issues, we couldn't include it. Another one that I personally think would have been very valuable, but it was extremely difficult to find the right type of expertise from all these important countries, was space. And the manner in which competition in space is also going to be a very crucial factor going forward. So we want to emphasize, by no means do we consider these 7 variables to be exhaustive or complete. It is a beginning, but we had to draw the line somewhere.
Very good. Thank you.
Yes. For my 2 cents on this, one of the things that has always struck me is that we have actually well-developed international institutions to move goods around, trading regime, and we have well-developed institutions and rules to move money around. You can transfer, but we don't have any sort of international agreements on how you move people. And the reason is that there's 193 countries in the world, and they all want to have independent control over who can enter their territory and the terms under which they can stay there. And you start coming up with we have the Refugee Convention, which is very narrowly defined, right? People fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution should not be returned back there. That's about all it agrees to. So economic refugees, people who are fleeing left, they're not covered by the Refugee Convention. As well. Coming up with any kind of given that every country wants to have its own principles for doing this, I think is a really, really big lift. And partly because the problems that different parts of the world are facing are radically different. The way Europe thinks about this problem is very different than the way Sub-Saharan Africa thinks about this problem for all sorts of reasons. The one thing that also gives me a little bit of optimism on this is, of course, that we have this big structural situation in the world where there's a bunch of rich countries that are getting old and depopulating, and there's a bunch of not rich countries that are relatively young, but may have trouble supporting their populations over time. A good economist would say, well, there's an equilibrium solution for this, but of course, political attitudes have opposed this. And I continue to believe that over time, more of the places that have been resistant to immigration are going to have to open up to it or see their economic prospects diminish dramatically. But I think that process, that political process, is unfortunately going to take a while.
Thank you. Next question, yes.
Good evening, John Martin, a second-year PhD student here at BU. Thank you so much for your time tonight and comments. I'm wondering if during the development of the report, our conceptualizations of war and peace came up. Ambassador Heine, you mentioned, Germany's not currently at war, but some of the asymmetric or hybrid, whatever you want to label it, different types of attacks that are conducted now, depending where you are, may feel like war. Or Professor Walt, you mentioned sanctions are a legitimate tool of statecraft. But obviously they are used, I think they've become so rampant for Americans to avoid war. So I'm wondering in the discourse, if just that the binary of peace and war came up, and if there's different views of that amongst the diverse group internationally. Thank you.
Very good. Trina, you want to address that?
You want to go first?
Well, just very, very quickly, yes, it did came up, and one of the obvious places it arose when we were trying to, first of all, talk about how the laws of war need to be updated to address this sort of hybrid warfare of different kinds. And it also certainly came up when people began to discuss some kind of code of conduct for the use of cyber weaponry. And were there, if you imagined attacks being conducted electronically, now we would say, it would be a violation of international law to deliberately attack a hospital. Okay, is it a violation of international law to deliberately attack the power supply with a cyber weapon, which cuts off the power to a hospital and therefore makes it impossible for the hospital to function, right? And so, yes, the issue did get addressed. Sort of the blurry gray area between the tanks are rolling versus we were happy and at peace.
Any consensus or no consensus?
Only that as we try to update the laws of war and of international humanitarian law, these new technologies and new ways of conducting international conflict, if you want to put it that way, are going to have to be addressed in ways that they currently are not.
And if I could add one thing, it's a great question. I think one of the differences in what was happening with this report and the development of it was that pretty quickly we had to go beyond conceptual questions and get to very granular solutions, which at times may lose sight of some of the questions that you raised. But we had to make these as practical as possible. But they were always there in the background. And I think in particular, on a couple of issues, it was quite clear, and you asked, is there a consensus? There's no consensus, for instance, to even call economic sanctions warfare. That right away raises massive red flags, etc. There's a consensus that we have a lot of challenges when it comes to IHL, but any effort to, for instance, reopen and do a review or try to strengthen the Geneva Conventions, there's a lot of nervousness about it, because there is a very legitimate fear that we will end up with reforms that actually hollows it out rather than strengthens it. So we were very explicit that any such reform should only be done with a mandate for strengthening it, precisely because we are worried that the memories of World War II, etc., have largely been lost, and as a result, the type of urgency, the type of lengths that countries were willing to go before in order to really strengthen them, unfortunately have been lost.
Next question. Yes, over here.
My name is Kate, and I was wondering, does the language of human rights appear in this report? And also, what do you think about the presence or trajectory of human rights discourse, like in future discussions of the international world order, law, rules, etc.?
So human rights, of course, is part of the discussion, but it was not a variable in and of itself. And I think some of the participants in the project, someone like Sam Moyne from Yale Law School has written extensively on this in terms of an argument he's making essentially, and I'm probably butchering it here now a little bit, but all of the efforts to make war more humane also made it more possible to have war rather than actually trying to prevent war. And much of what we were trying to do here, again, very security focused. We have full acknowledgement that if all of these ideas and some of them additional ones would be adopted, we would still have a pretty ugly system with a lot of flaws. But it would probably be stable. And at the end of the day, that is a massive achievement in and of itself. Once you open up for the human rights angle or try to include it here more explicitly, then you are going to see a dramatic divergence of opinions that really takes the sovereignty principle to the test. Of course, as Steve pointed out, the US may actually switch sides in that debate. But I would say that there is already a convergence towards a more strict sovereignty perspective amongst a very large number of questions, which has, again, mindful of Gaza and other things, made it very, very difficult for Western countries to push those agendas, since it's not done with in a manner that one can say that they're living up to it themselves.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Shayna. I'm a senior undergraduate at the Pardee School. And my question is, Dr. Parsi, going off what you said in your last, what you were speaking about last, about that the memories of World War II are so far away and those tragedies. Speaking to a room full of mostly students, how do you suggest that we enter this work in ways that will not harm the order and will make it better, not continue to hollow it out or to hurt? How do we start going about this in a way that is safe and ethical and not more dangerous?
Step one, read the report and memorize it. Every single word of it. I would say, since we are largely American audience, my plea would be to recognize that, of course, traditionally, the United States, having been a unipolar power for understandable reasons, had an interesting relationship with international law to begin with. Forget about rules at this point, but international law. And there is a very strong sovereignty tradition in the United States as well, which at times have been a bit absurd. Let me give you a small example. When I was working on Capitol Hill 20 plus years ago, representing a district in Ohio, I used to get phone calls, or the office got phone calls, in which constituents were very worried about these 7 black helicopters on the 11th floor of the UN building or something like that. And I had to ask other people in the office, what is this? I never heard about this. And they said, well, there's this conspiracy theory that there are these hyper-technological black helicopters in the UN building ready to take over the US at any moment. And I was like, okay, well, this is interesting. What do I say when constituents call and say this? I say, just tell them we're on it. So it was an affirmation of this conspiracy theory. So we have that. But as we're entering a world in which the United States no longer is that unipolar power, and as a result may not see the same value in international law in terms of binding other states, particularly rival states, towards certain behaviors, we have to reassess our relationship with international law, because in a world in which our power alone no longer can do this, I think we will discover, and hopefully before it's too late, that international law actually ends up becoming extremely valuable in terms of making sure that rival states don't behave in ways that are problematic for us and the rest of the world, and that our power alone no longer actually can fully address. And that we don't want to be in a world in which, again, as a non-unipolar power, we have to rely so overwhelmingly just on our power, rather than having other instruments at our disposal to be able to advance US interest and security. So I think there is going to be a natural realization of this over time. The question is, can we have a proactive understanding of this? Making sure that we're moving ahead of this and actually, again, as we said in the report, reinvest in and rejuvenate these institutions, precisely because they actually lie in our own national interest to do so, particularly in the future, as these trends are likely going to continue without any major disruption.
Very good. On that note, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our speakers for this excellent presentation.